Dear speakers, dear colleagues, public health communities acknowledge easily what vaccines in general have brought to global health improvement. On a daily basis before the pandemic, European public health professionals had for sure discussions on vaccines, on optimal use of available vaccines, on vaccine calendar, on improving the rates of population vaccinated, on society distrust on vaccines, rumors, and anti-vax movements. And for those interested in global health, it covered also contributing to international programs for financing and distributing vaccines in the less wealthy part of the world. But much less public health professionals have been following the more technical aspects involved in making those products available. All of it involving political, legal, financial and industrial sectors, often at very global level in a global market with multinational players. During the first part of the pandemic crisis, vaccines were hypothetical, just strong wishes, and suddenly it became a possible issue. Discussions at the highest level brought in the front line many discussions, acronyms, and concepts rather new for most EU health professionals. It was related to making sure vaccines would be available in the EU countries, but also for the world. Engagements from political leaders on intellectual property waivers brought in response counter-arguments from many serious public figures or organizations. And suddenly all appeared more complex than we thought. Act Accelerator, COVAX, tech transfer, patent pooling, TRIPS agreement, voluntary licensing, compulsory licensing, donation of vaccines. And we at Société Française de Santé Publique were wondering, should we support officially our French president on the waiver issue? We decided to ask EUPHA what was done by other public health societies in Europe. And here we are, asking our speakers to help us clarify what is at stake and for which expected results, and how we can be of some help. So thank you for being with us, and I let the floor now to our speakers.
So thank you very much, Yves, for this. To say that at the European Public Health Association, the Health Technology Assessment section, when this request came from the Société de Santé Publique, from the French Association, we were rather happy because we were looking at the issue, not only of the pandemic treaty, but also discussions on the waiver. But these discussions for us were touching upon topics which we have been monitoring and looking at for many years. So in addition to vaccines, challenges in terms of diagnostics and therapeutics, and broader issues of innovation and new or emerging health technologies, which are often linked to how we assess them, how we provide incentives for them, R&D dynamics, research and development dynamics, and the different ways we have to regulate all of these products across the world. Additionally, of course, there's a history in public health of access issues in ARVs and antiretrovirals, and many issues arising from different kinds of contractual agreements for access, not only in developing, but also in developed countries. So we wanted to focus in this series, the very first meeting that we have on the role that Europe can have, and also to look at the dynamics that we potentially have for longer term implications, not only for the coronavirus, but also for challenges like tuberculosis, TB, which has been there for many years, and for AMR, for antimicrobial resistance, which has been very, let us say, burning issue, both from an R&D perspective and from a broader public health perspective. And with that, I would like to introduce the first speaker, and we are very honored and thankful that Professor Stiglitz, an economist, was able to join us, and rather gladly agreed to join us. He is, of course, as most of you I'm sure know, a Nobel laureate for economics. He has served as a chief economist at the World Bank and the US Council of Economic Advisors, but he has also initiated different think tanks and dialogue in the more technical field differentiation between, let's say, patents for common goods for health or global health and or environmental patents. So without much ado, I would like him to come to the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And this, thank you for organizing this session, which I think is extraordinarily important. There are 4 points I want to make in my limited time. The first is really something that all of you are much more aware of than I am, that there's not going to be the world's not going to be safe from the pandemic until the whole pandemic is controlled everywhere. This is a global health issue, and it's a particular concern because of the mutations of COVID-19, which means that there is always the risk, as long as the disease is festering, that there will develop a mutation which is more virulent, more contagious, more deadly, and even vaccine resistant. So it is really important from that global public health view that the disease be put under control quickly. It's also important from a global economic perspective because the global economy has been the largest downturn that we've had in memory, and we won't have a recovery from the economic downturn, the pandemic downturn, until the disease is put under control. And the economic downturn is a public health issue. A lot of people millions of people have been put into poverty, and that poverty will lead to lack of access to health, lack of access to adequate nutrition, will lead to unnecessary deaths. So both for health and economic reasons, it is imperative, it is urgent that the COVID-19 be put under control. And that requires access to vaccines. It will only be done if there's access to vaccines. Now, that brings me to the second point. It's not just an issue of equity. Yes, there are enormous issues of inequities in the availability of vaccines. In the United States now, it's easy to get a vaccine. In developing countries, virtually impossible. And obviously, we all are sensitive to those inequities. But the reality is that there is a shortage of the global supply. And current projections are that there won't be enough supply of vaccines to immunize everybody in the world for a couple of years. And that means the real risk of the COVID-19 festering and mutating. So that means we have to focus on the issue of that total supply, not just the distribution. Yes, the distribution is important, and COVAX has played an important role. Contributions have played important. Various countries have played an important role. But I want to focus on the total supply, and this is where the waiver of the intellectual property rights that is being discussed at the WTO becomes so important. A natural question is, why is there this limited supply? We now have the knowledge of how to produce not just one vaccine, but multiple vaccines. There's no inherent reason why we can't ramp up supply more quickly. At various times, there's been discussions of shortages of syringes, of vials, of all kinds of ingredients. But the basic fact is that most of those ingredients are things that could be increased in supply relatively rapidly. So a critical constraint in the supply chain is intellectual property, access to intellectual property. Now, it is important for there to be that to be accompanied by the transfer of technology, but if we changed the intellectual property regime and made it, if we made it access to the intellectual property more wide, there would be incentives for various firms to actually supply, to help engage in that technology transfer. So technology transfer can be viewed as an endogenous variable. It will be affected by the vaccine waiver. So the second point I want to emphasize is what is the operative constraint right now is intellectual property. The vaccine waiver being discussed at the WTO would have a significant effect on the aggregate supply. It's not the only thing that needs to be done. There are other things that need to be done. One doesn't have to do one or the other. There is an urgency here, and everything that could increase the supply as rapidly as possible ought to be done. But the vaccine waiver is one of the critical things in increasing the supply. It would make a difference. It's particularly important when we realize, and this is the third point, that the pharmaceutical industry as a whole is not interested in maximizing the supply. Their interest is basically increasing profits. And profits are increased when supply is constrained. That leads to higher prices. If you look at what Pfizer has announced, what it anticipates as the price at which it plans to be selling its vaccines in the coming year, it is very clear that it expects that there will be a significant constraint on aggregate supply, total supply of vaccines from all sources of vaccines. It's not just the mRNA vaccines, but all the vaccines. So it is counting on the continuation of a supply shortage. That is its model. That's its market model. So we can't rely on the private sector, on the monopolies, on those with market power to increase the supply. That is not in their interest. Their interest is limiting the supply. Now, the major argument against the vaccine waiver is that, yes, it might lead to an increasing supply today, but what happens in the long run? What will be the long run effect on innovation? Well, I don't believe it will have any significant effect on innovation. And let me try to explain why that is the case. First, the basic research underlying the new vaccines has been provided by the government, by the public. And the development of the vaccines has been largely supported by the public. We have provided most of the money associated with the development of the vaccines. So the basic investments have not been done by the private sector, but by the government. The second point is that the producers of the vaccines, the owners of the intellectual property, will still be compensated under the waiver. It's only that they won't necessarily get the monopoly returns, but they will get more than a normal return on their capital. So, in fact, companies like Pfizer and Moderna have already gotten more than a normal return on their investment, even compensated for the risk that they've faced. So that the vaccine waiver itself at the WTO does not take away their right to get a more than a decent return on their capital. So there will be a continuation of research in the future. The third point is that it isn't a change, actually. in the overall framework of intellectual property rights. At the time the WTO was established, there were provisions for compulsory licenses in times of a public health, of a need for public health, and if there ever was a time, this is it. Those provisions were reinforced in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic at the beginning of this century. So the principle of compulsory licenses in the context of a pandemic is already part of the international legal framework. The United States, for instance, discussed using the compulsory licenses when we faced a much less threat of the anthrax in the aftermath of 2001, when we were discussing issuing a compulsory license for Cipro, which is the drug that is the most effective response to anthrax. So it's not a change in the legal framework. It does lower the transaction costs. In fact, the transaction costs in context of some of the COVID-19 intellectual property are sufficiently high to be a real barrier. And the point is that there's an urgency here, that if this were something that we could take years and years to deal with, eventually the compulsory licenses would be issued and things, we wouldn't need the vaccine waiver. But we are facing a crisis. And the urgency here means that we need the waiver and we need it quickly. If the waiver had been adopted months ago when it was first proposed, vaccine supply would already be larger than it is today. So the issue here isn't whether the pharmaceutical industries will get a decent return, whether this is taking away their property rights. It's not doing that. It's only whether they will get excessive monopoly returns in the thousands of percent at the cost of the pandemic continuing around the world. So from my perspective, it's unambiguous. It is in the interest of the world as a whole that the vaccine waiver should be adopted. Economists talk about things that make everybody better off without making anybody worse off. We call that Pareto optimality, Pareto efficiency. In this case, the only people who are going to be worse off are the monopolists in the drug industry. The rest of the international community will be much better off if we get the disease under control. And one step in getting the disease under control is the vaccine waiver. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I will stick to one question, because I think, so as to allow for as many as panelists as we can before we circle back to you. So I think you've answered all of our questions. The one thing I would like you to perhaps explain a little bit in terms of the dynamics, and also to have your insight, is the role of the European Union. I mean, at the moment, we've seen very certain dynamics with 2 or 3 countries. I'm not going to say determining how other countries behave, but pretty much dominant beyond G7 or G20 dynamics. There are 2 or 3 countries which have very specific policies and which are also putting forth the argument of raw materials and supply chains and networks and even geopolitical dynamics. So do you think there is a concrete risk for Europe if it supports this? And or do you think there are other things that the European Union, including its public health professionals, should push for, argue for, or support? And last but not least, there are different narratives emerging as Europe will be harmed in the case of these waivers, such waivers being implemented, not necessarily in the sense of mRNA vaccines or patents, but in the sense of a precedent, setting a precedent. What is an emergency? Well, when you have an emergency. So I'm not quite sure what is being discussed in terms of macroeconomics, but we have a lot of that narrative going around. So a comment on that.
Yeah. Well, let me be quite frank. Europe right now is the major barrier to the adoption of the vaccine waiver. President Biden has supported it. More than 100 countries around the world have supported it. A few European countries are the major impediment to the adoption of the vaccine waiver. And they've done it, I think, under a misunderstanding. One of the opposition is Germany, and one can view it in terms of, they think there's a German company that is one of the innovators in mRNA. But interestingly, that company has sold the its intellectual property rights to an American company, Pfizer. So Germany's interest today is zero in the vaccine waiver. The production rights around the world are held by Pfizer. So it's not actually even in Germany's narrow interest in this particular case. I addressed the question about whether there are other supply constraints. Almost all the supply constraints that I've seen talked about are supply constraints that would easily be remedied. Glass vials, syringes. Yes, they may be in short supply. You don't expect to inject billions all of a sudden, but those are the kinds of production that can be ramped up very quickly if it was known that there was going to be a demand. So the question that economists ask is, what is the operative constraint? If we lift that constraint, will other things respond? And it's unambiguous. If we lift the intellectual property constraint through the vaccine waiver, the other supply constraints will be reduced. I don't say they're going to be eliminated, but what I emphasized was that there's an urgency here. We need to do everything we can to increase the supply. And among the most important things in increasing the supply is the vaccine waiver. I think we have, as that vaccine waiver gets lifted, we will have to look very carefully to see if there are other bottlenecks. And if there are other bottlenecks, we'll have to do everything we can to remove those bottlenecks. I don't think we will see other bottlenecks. I think they will get lifted on their own. But if there are, we address those. You don't say, because we can't get enough syringes, we should stop this. We obviously know we can get more syringes. And that's true of the other parts of the supply chain. Those who've looked at it very carefully have made convincing arguments that though there is what we would call a elasticity of supply in the relevant time frame. Now, on the final question, is this setting a bad precedent? I actually think it's setting a good precedent. As I said, it's not a change in the intellectual property framework. The intellectual property rights framework always had this provision for what they call it in WTO language flexibility, what normal people think about as compulsory licenses. It's already there. This is only a question is when it's urgent, we ought to do it urgently. We shouldn't let transaction costs delay, foot dragging by the drug industry, allow them to get more profits while the rest of the world suffers. So it is not a change in the intellectual property framework. And as I emphasized, they still get royalties. They still get royalties. It is not taking away their property. They get compensated. So the fact is, these arguments that have been put up by several European countries, Germany most importantly, actually have no merit. And so to me, I've thought about these, looked at them in detail, and I think it's really very clear that these are specious arguments that are being put forward. And the foot dragging is going to cost the world a great deal.
Thank you very, very much. There are a couple of questions which, however, have to do with the role of the Global South and regulatory aspects and a raised hand. So I would suggest, in the interest of time, so that you have a chance to respond, that we go from me to the next speaker, which is Andy Asamoah from Africa and from Global South perspective. And then I keep these questions to the ones that have raised hand for the last, if you like, 20 minutes that we have you with us. So thank you very much.
So, Andy Asamoah, are you there? And Andy Asamoah is from Ghana, entrepreneur in Ghana, and but he was in WHO for 30 years before retiring in Ghana. And he has been in the last 10 years and as president of the Fondation Institut Pasteur in Dakar, which is a Senegalese foundation linked to Institut Pasteur in Paris. But they have been producing vaccine on yellow fever for a long time, and there are some opportunities that they can join in producing COVID-19 vaccine. So I pass the floor to Andy to explain how he sees the situation of Africa now regarding those issues.
Thank you very much, Yves. I think Professor Stiglitz actually put in a nutshell the problem facing Africa, which is vaccine availability. So what I'm going to do is to look at the cases in Africa, is to look at vaccine distribution, the possibility of Africa developing vaccines, and also what we feel the EU and the other developed countries can do to help Africa. As you know, the situation changes rapidly. And as it's very dynamic, and as we are speaking, every day something changes. So I'm just going to give you, in a nutshell, the situation in Africa. The confirmed cases. The confirmed cases in Africa, as at the 2nd of July, where there were in 57 countries in Africa, about 5.5 confirmed cases. And please note that 1/3 of all these cases are from South Africa. Then we have 563,000 active cases, about 4.8 million recoveries, and 143,000 deaths. Now, when you compare the situation in Africa to other countries, it doesn't look too bad, but unfortunately, it's changing very rapidly. The highly transmissible Delta variant, initially identified in India, is now rampaging Africa in the 3rd wave, and the numbers are doubling every week. This variant is affecting young and healthier population. Presently, over 20 countries in the southern and northern part of Africa, because the weather now is a bit colder there. And now it's also coming to Nigeria, Ghana, and the other countries in West Africa. What is worrying us is that the lack of vaccination is allowing a very fast spread of the COVID. Now, what is the vaccine distribution and availability situation in Africa? As at 2nd July 2021, 2.66% of the population, comprising of 57 countries with a population of 1.3 billion, have received only 1 dose, have received 2 doses. Then 1.04 have received the required doses. So in effect, Africa has about 1% of the population vaccinated. Compare this to what is happening in other parts of the world. According to available data, out of 2.9 billion doses administered globally, only 47.5 million have been administered in Africa. The COVAX program, backed by the WHO and other multilateral bodies, aims to supply 600 million doses to vaccinate at least 20% of the population in Africa. So far, only about 50 million have been supplied as of 1st July this year. The COVAX supplied the AstraZeneca Covishield, which is produced by the Serum Institute of India. And with the increase in confirmed cases in India, the supply to Africa has almost stopped. In addition, the program is under financial pressure as it struggles to reach its target of 6.8 billion. So far, according to available records, it has raised 2.6 billion by pledges, some of which are yet to be redeemed. Now, the World Bank is partnering with the African Union COVID vaccine acquisition team to deploy vaccines to 400 million. These agreements are mostly intention to supply than finalize sales contracts. IMF has drawn an agreement to lend countries in Africa 23 billion to purchase COVID vaccines. The US government has provided $4 billion to COVAX and the African CDD to provide 5 million doses of Johnson & Johnson. Only this morning, I read from CDD Africa that they have just received 400 million doses of Johnson & Johnson for Africa. I think this will go a long way. Now, due to the global pandemic, the real GDP in Africa has contracted by 2.1% in 2020. It is hoped in 2021, there may be an increase of about 1.5%. In May 2021, President Macron of France hosted leaders of African countries and heads of global financial institutions for a summit to seek to provide the continent with critical financing due to the impact of COVID. The leaders also pleaded for supply of vaccines from EU. According to records available, so far, not a single dose of vaccine has been supplied directly from the stock in Europe. Individual African countries are finding it difficult to obtain vaccines because of stockpiling by major vaccine producing nations and the scramble for early access by the world's richest countries, as well as production constraints facing manufacturers. The African countries are finding it difficult to obtain vaccines directly from manufacturers and sometimes have to go through middlemen at exorbitant prices. China and Russia have signed agreements with individual African countries to supply vaccines. African countries trying to buy vaccines directly from manufacturers in Europe have been told that production for 2021 have all been sold. In addition to difficulties in obtaining supplies, transport, storage, and distribution issues also present major challenge for the delivery across much of Africa. Now, what is the COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing situation in Africa? In Africa, countries with potential for local production and the license arrangements are Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, South Africa, and Senegal. Other countries may be able to do packaging and labeling. Presently, South African company Aspen Pharmacare has entered into agreement with Johnson & Johnson and started the manufacturing of its COVID vaccine in South Africa. Egypt has also announced agreement with China to manufacture Chinese COVID vaccine. Belgium has entered into agreement with Institut Pasteur of Dakar, Senegal, for collaboration with Universals to begin packaging and distribution in early 2022 and move into full production by the end of 2022. Germany is also in discussions with Institut Pasteur to discuss production of COVID-19 vaccines. Now, how can the EU support Africa? They can support by donating vaccines directly to African countries or support COVAX financially. Encourage vaccine manufacturers in Europe to sell some of their surplus vaccines to African countries. EU countries must redeem pledges to COVAX to enable them continue distribution to Africa. AstraZeneca, which is produced in India, should be recognized by the EU passport scheme to make it easier for travelers from Africa to travel to EU countries. There is need for Africa-based framework for accelerated and equal distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and technologies to Africa. Stronghold on vaccine intellectual properties must be reduced, and EU should lend intellectual capacity to African countries to produce COVID-19 vaccines. EU must also support African countries to improve the quality of healthcare centers for ensuring equal access to the vaccines. Raw materials for production of vaccines must be made available to African countries with capacity to produce. Now, if we go by what Joseph said, once we have the vaccine waiver, then there should be no problem for Africa, at least for the countries who have the capacity to produce. Okay, so this is, I must say that Africa has also not helped itself very much, because at the beginning, we should also have come together with the AU to really try to buy some of the vaccines in advance. We waited till all the vaccines have been sold before we started scrambling to buy vaccines. Also, Africa should also have allowed itself for some of the testing to be done here, or that also did not help. So much as we need support from outside, we also in Africa must do our part to make it possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. I think we have time for one question, an additional question that I would like to put, which is, how do you see it touched to your last point, which is how are moving African countries today to work together on this pandemic? Eventually to buy vaccines, but also to be able to better use, if there is a waiver of intellectual property rights, how will it work for countries together, and et cetera, et cetera? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think the COVID in a way have brought Africa together. Now we have the CDD Africa at the AU, and now they are joining together. For example, the 400 million doses supplied by the United States was not given to individual African countries. It was all given to CDD Africa, and they will share it proportionately among the countries. Now with this CDD working, now it will be easier for Africans to identify countries where vaccine production, for example, we can choose Senegal, we can choose South Africa, we can choose Egypt to produce, to share to the whole of Africa.
Thank you. Elena, do we go on?
Thank you. We do go on because we're hoping if George is kind enough to go fast, we may be able to circle back to Professor Stiglitz to comment on Dr. Samoa's and Professor Pavlakis' comments. So George Pavlakis is a fellow Greek. I'm very proud that he's a fellow Greek. And he's also, he's the chief of the Human Retrovirus section in the National Cancer Institute, the National Institutes of Health in the US, across the Atlantic. He also has a lot of patents in his name, and he has trained many people that are currently doing a lot of R&D, particularly in the field of retroviruses. And he was one of the first people to be involved in HIV and AIDS research, and I'm talking 20, 30 years ago. He was, I don't want to go very technical, but he has many firsts. The first one to develop bioassays on transactivation, the first one to develop, or major contribution to develop mRNA codon optimization methods. So he brings on board the perspective of a researcher with a lot of patents and experience on National Institutes R&D and also knowledge transfer. And without, again, much ado, I pass the ball to George. If you want to share your slides or you want me to do it.
I share my screen.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Can you see it or?
Nope.
No, okay. I'll try again.
You have to press the green button at the bottom.
Yeah.
No?
Did it work?
Yes.
I think we can see your slides. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I'll try to be on time. These are my disclaimers. So I'll just say that all my patents are managed by NCI, so I don't have any personal conflicts. And I just want to say briefly that the pandemic is still early. We see it expanding continuously, and it has similarities with the 100-year-old major flu epidemic of 1918. We see that today, approximately, we have 185 million infections counted, and we have just about 4 million deaths. And the first million happened in 9 months, the second in 4, and then the third and the fourth in 3 months or less. So even without counting recent India. So the epidemic, if anything, accelerates. We are still at the beginning. And just to tell you my bias straight out, I think that the appropriate response of the human society is elimination, to achieve as fast as possible elimination of the virus. Many countries did not follow that. There's a minority of countries that decided to try for elimination. The first one was China. It took, of course, a hard and harsh effort, but they managed to do it, and they returned to economic development straight from the previous year, the 2020, and they continue to develop. Obviously, the rest of the world went into problems that we all know, but there is a recent study of the OECD countries that they chose to attempt elimination of the virus. These are the 5 OECD countries that are shown here. And what the data showed, looking for more than a year of the epidemic now, is that not only the elimination strategy resulted in less suffering measured by deaths or any other measure, as shown here, but also there was less effects on GDP. Most of the time they were ahead, and also their citizens, they had less restrictions overall, so more freedom. So elimination clearly is better. So I just, in summary, I want to make these points that the epidemic is still early. Elimination is, I think, my preferred by far strategy. And we are lucky to have safe and effective vaccines, some of them brand new technologies. They are developed in record time with a fantastic effort. So unfortunately, in my opinion, USA and the European Union and many other countries have opted for mitigation, and they rely now on vaccines mainly to stop the epidemic. I think that this is recently a major mistake to let the Delta variant essentially unchallenged. And I think that this is probably going to be paid dearly because as the virus expands worldwide, as you know, and mostly unchallenged because it's a new virus, it creates a very dangerous mutant situation. Because we see in real time a major epidemic to adapt better to the human population. It transmits faster and many times manages to avoid the immune system. And also in many areas in the world, we have syndemics. That means two epidemics together. For example, the coronavirus and HIV is very dangerous because it creates a situation where mutants can thrive in the same patient. So we do know that in this schematic that coronavirus is airborne, is better, faster transmitted than flu, and the mutants are much faster transmitted than coronavirus, and they tend to look much more like the protagonist of transmission measles, which is a scary thought. When do we expect to develop herd immunity by vaccines or natural infection? This is, I think, far, far away and goes further because of the new variants. They cause new epidemic waves, even in areas that they have high seropositivity, either by natural infection or by vaccines. So we have to achieve very high levels, in my opinion, above 80–85% of the population in order to have protection. So this is a major threat, and coronavirus is going to stay with the human population for a long time. The most likely scenario is that we're going to have frequent and periodic epidemics like flu. I should mention that this pandemic is related and interlinked with the climate change, the ecosystem damage that we see all over the world, and we expect more epidemics like that. So for the time being, the vaccine is the major tool, and we were fortunate that our previous investment in AIDS and bioterrorism infrastructure was ready, more or less, to respond to the coronavirus. And due to also massive government support and intervention, we had major and rapid progress, unprecedented. As you heard, I am a veteran of wars, prior wars on HIV and AIDS. And I do want to mention that in addition to the AIDS pandemics providing us with a lot of the tools in vaccinology that otherwise wouldn't have, that although we don't have an AIDS vaccine yet, we do have appropriate drug combinations. And if we look back in the AIDS history, and I will not go through that, we'll see that all the questions about poor countries' accessibility of either vaccines or drugs they were playing 20 or 25 years ago, starting with South Africa, Brazil, Thailand, and other countries, that they tried to protect their citizens by providing antiretroviral drugs against AIDS. They faced tremendous opposition from the major pharmaceuticals and the US government, I must say. But eventually, under pressure, the US backed off somehow a little bit, and tremendous credit goes to the AIDS activists, people that I know and have worked with for many, many years. They were instrumental in changing the tide. They fought hard and established, in principle, the right to health care, which in principle, of course, but not in practice yet, overrides the intellectual property and the pharma company desires. I do need to mention the Bush administration successful program, PEPFAR, which not only provided drugs for Africa, but also provided a lot of infrastructure development that is really very handy now. And we see the results throughout poor countries that they can do things that they could never do before during the AIDS days, but they were more ready, although not completely, for the coronavirus. So there are counter arguments about, for the proposition of we just get rid or abolish intellectual property for this specific vaccine situation, because the rich countries and the pharmaceutical companies argue that we demand high standards for our drugs, safety, in terms of safety, quality, and efficacy. And these things are expensive. They require a lot of investment, a lot of infrastructure. And the application of compulsory licensing and parallel import that have been given a bad name, although there is a lot of countries in the world, including European Union countries, England and US itself, as Dr. Stiglitz mentioned, that they threaten with compulsory licensing to protect their citizens at times. So this is the case to do now, but I would say that the intellectual property itself is not the only focus. I would say that the real need is for a complete technology transfer at all levels. That was the case that helped in the AIDS situation. But the rich countries, they make the argument that without strong IP protection, we are in unmapped territory and there will be probably no incentive for investment. That has been dismissed by many, but we are indeed in unmapped territory. And I just finish by saying that I do agree that coronavirus pandemic is an opportunity for global action, coordination, and change of way and improving the way that we do things, because we are all threatened by the virus and we're not going to be safe until we take care of the entire globe. But a simple proposal would be that vaccines and therapeutics related to coronavirus would be distributed equally in rich and poor countries, and each one will pay according to their country income, for example. But there is a lot of problems to make that acceptable, because if the rich countries are afraid that compulsory licensing and parallel import is going to threaten their lead position and dominance of technology dominance. And if anything, one of the lessons of the pandemic is that it showed that one of the things that happens is that the borders close and then everybody becomes defensive, and therefore if you depend on other countries, you may find yourself in a very difficult situation. So of course the rich countries, they don't want to abolish their dominance. And we have to work more collectively to solve these really underlying problems, which is not simply patents, but the whole package of technology and what is appropriate to do for the global village that affects and things like the coronavirus that affects all of us. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Because Professor Stiglitz has to leave in 3 minutes, I'll circle back to him and then I'll come to you for questions. So you are actually making a suggestion for combating the pandemic now, which pertains to distribution versus long-term investment and so on. And of course, there are discussions about foreign direct investment, controlling interests and so on. So going back to Professor Stiglitz, do you think this is the most viable solution? And if so, is there a law for multilateral body? Should we have a short-term strategy for coronavirus and a different one for the longer term?
Well, I think that we may be facing pandemics in the future, so that we need a structure that can handle this pandemic and the future pandemics. I think most of the issues that have been raised could be dealt with within the WHO, existing multilateral institutions. For instance, one of the issues that was raised was concern about the quality and safety. Well, that requires, you might say, a global regulatory body to inspect the quality of medicines. So that's not hard. We know how to do that. So that's an example of a specious argument. Yes, we want to make sure everything is good quality. So we need to make sure that anything that is sold as a vaccine has an approval of a regulatory authority. The regulatory authorities around the world can get together and create a global regulatory authority that has the world's confidence that the vaccines made in Europe, made in Africa or India, are safe and effective. It's not that hard to do. One of the interesting points that was just made that I want to highlight is that part of the concern in this moment of, you might say, new protectionism that has arisen is that each country feels more comfortable, safer, having some production locally. EU and the United States are talking about it, but it's also something of concern in Africa. But that's another reason why we need the vaccine waiver, so that there can be production in Africa and Latin America and in Asia. And the transfer of technology basically requires the kind of training of the scientists and the production engineers. And that can easily be done as part of a global response, as it was done, as mentioned before, in HIV/AIDS. Thailand, Brazil, South Africa, Senegal have all had the capacity to produce, and other countries can develop the capacity to produce. So it illustrates another theme that I wanted. And I want to come back to one other question that you asked at the end of the previous, and that is, you might say, global geopolitics. Right now, Russia is transferring technology to developing countries and to emerging markets. If you think that there's a geopolitical conflict going on, we're losing. The West is losing because of the hoarding of vaccines, and intellectual property is exhibiting the worst aspects of the market economy: monopoly, selfishness, greed, all together. And we saw it was sometimes disparage what has come to be called vaccine diplomacy. But what is more important than life and health? And Russia is making those transfers, recognizing that it is really important that we not only adopt the vaccine waiver, but that we also then work hard to transfer the technology and to make sure that there are not other bottlenecks on the inputs, so that, as it was just pointed out, the world's not going to be safe until everywhere is safe. And from what I've seen, the only way to do that is really the elimination of the disease.
Can I?
Yes, George.
I ask a question, basically, or is part comment, part question. I've been involved in several teams that try to address different crises over the year. And we classically say in such cases, let's try to also turn the crisis into an opportunity to do good. That's the classical saying. And it works sometimes. I mean, a very characteristic example, we've been working for nucleic acid deliveries and vaccines for 20 years. And the industry was just giving us the cold shoulder. But now with the opportunity of the coronavirus, not only we have this technology applied, but it's applied in a billion bodies, which is mind-boggling, because for the last 20 years that I've been involved, we managed to do 1,000 humans maybe or whatever, and all of a sudden, so there is the case to turn a crisis into an opportunity to improve things. But the counter argument is that when there is a real crisis, people get defensive, and as you mentioned, and they try to take care of the immediate, and they don't want a lot of change necessarily. They try to find probably the easiest and the fastest way to do things, or the most familiar. And the question that I pose is there the right time to try to increase capacity in Africa, or is there a better way to expand factories in the countries that they can easily do it? They have established capacity, they can easily be double and tripled and quadrupled, like the industry showed us the previous year, so that we take care of the crisis now, and of course we try to plan better for the future.
Well, I think my response is you want to do both. Because of the urgency that you emphasized, accelerating production as fast as possible is really important. And therefore, we know that there are companies in India and South Africa that are already producing, and that with financial assistance could expand their production. We know that there have to be some expansion of some of the supply chain, and we can figure out those are
which the shortages are real. Shortages of raw material is real. And US, for example, as you know, threatened the previous months to cut the supply, and that had caused tremendous headaches in some European companies.
Yeah. So what I want to emphasize is that you want to think about the whole supply chain, but most of those constraints are not long-run constraints. There are things that can be lifted relatively rapidly. And we've shown that we've been able to produce very quickly more than a billion shocks. So I think the first order thing is expanding production as fast as one can because of the urgency. But the disease is going to be around for a while. You emphasize that we're just at the beginning, and that there is a high probability that it will be around. We may need to have booster shots. So I think this is an occasion to say, okay, it may take 6 months or even a year to develop capacity in some new countries that don't currently have that capacity, but we should do it urgently. So we're not, in terms of the global economy with a GDP of around, let's say, $100 trillion, we're talking about billions, spending billions of dollars. That's a minuscule amount. And the cost-benefit ratio is overwhelming that we ought to be doing it. There are estimates of the loss from the COVID-19, if it just continues for one additional year, is actually in the range of trillions of dollars. So I've seen estimates of like $10 trillion, half of which are in the developed countries. So it's in our interest to spend a few billions of dollars to increase the capacity in developing countries in order to produce vaccines to get the disease under control, eliminate it.
So if you manage to stay with us for another 20 minutes to hear Ellen, it would be wonderful and else. But George,
I can't stay for 20 minutes. I can stay for a few more minutes. Yeah.
Let's see, because and just to say, so that we manage before passing the ball, we've copied all the questions. We'll try to get back to the speakers because we will be doing a report on the webinar. So anybody that has written questions, we have saved all of them because they're all very interesting questions. This is a very complex topic. So passing the ball back to you for Ellen. And thanks very much. Sorry I had to cut you, George, Professor Stiglitz, but Helen is also important. Thanks.
Thank you. And I will really quickly pass the floor to Helen, who for me is my reference when I speak about the patents, access to essential medicines, patent pooling. And I understood a few things thanks to her. So I will pass the floor very quickly for the topic. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Yves, for this kind introduction. Let me share my screen. If it all goes well, you should be seeing my slides now. Does that work? Hold on. Can someone say that it works?
Yes.
It works fine.
It does.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, this is my title slide. This is my interest declaration, which basically explains why I'm still not rich. A word about intellectual property. I think it might be helpful because this term is used a lot, but it's a bit of an unhelpful term because under the banner of intellectual property, you actually see a variety of legal rights that result from intellectual activity in industrial, scientific, literary, and artistic fields. So in the field of medicine, patents and undisclosed data are the most relevant. And the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement that was adopted in 1994 sets out the minimum requirements for the protection of intellectual property. And this, of course, happened before the HIV crisis and before all kinds of other health crises that did not inform the negotiations. Now, a word about patents, because that is the form of intellectual property that is most discussed in the context of access to medicines, but now also in the context of access to vaccines, although we need to expand that, and I'll address that in a minute. But the function of patents is to encourage inventors to make investments. So it is meant to protect the investments that innovators make. And that is in exchange for the disclosure of this invention. The patent system, therefore, is a social policy tool, and it is meant to create benefits for society as a whole. It is not solely meant to create benefits for the patent holders. And one sometimes gets the impression that that's what the patent system is for, but it's not. As we know, patents come with a cost to society, and in some cases with a cost to individuals when the individuals cannot afford the medicines that they need. Because in general, production of medicines, and that's also true for many of the vaccines that we're talking about, the cost is very low. The prices can be extremely high because of these government-sanctioned monopolies. Those monopolies are time-bound, minimum of 20 years, but that is quite generous and can cause huge problems. Some of you have already talked about the HIV crisis. It was actually the HIV access to medicines crisis that led to the discussions at the World Trade Organizations that led to the adoption of the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health. And I put this up here because in paragraph 4, the Ministerial Conference actually agreed that the protection of public health should have precedence over the protection of intellectual property. Countries can protect the interests of public health even in the face of patents. And for HIV, this has been enormously important because after the adoption of this declaration, developing countries the globe over started to use government use. It's a particular form of compulsory licensing to allow for the production and the imports of low-priced generic antiretroviral medicines. Now we are in 2021 COVID crisis, so 20 years later, global pandemic. I don't need to go into the details. What has been unprecedented, not only the size of this pandemic, but has also been the response. The scientific response have absolutely been magnificent, with enormous collaboration and sharing and openness in the world of science. Now, that openness that we saw in the world of science sort of disappeared when the products that were developed as a result of that became proprietary products of the drug companies. We also saw early on in the crisis, European Union leaders make promises of global public goods. I remember Emmanuel Macron saying, "No one shall own this vaccine." Angela Merkel promised that the COVID-19 vaccine would be a global public good. But what actually happened with vast amounts of public financing is the creation of new intellectual property with the challenges that brought it with it. Now, on this public investment that has been very significant, and I would like to say up front, I think that is a very good thing. That's exactly how you want the public sector, how you want governments to respond to a crisis like this, that is to make sure that the government at large, the public at large, carries the risks of the development of products that are needed, in particular the vaccines. Some of you talked about the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, for example, that benefited from significant amounts of German government, but also European Investment Bank financing. Now, this public financing would have been the opportunity to require that intellectual property, including patents, knowledge, know-how, technology generated with public financing, is shared. And that opportunity would have been, it's a very reasonable demand, a very reasonable proposition, because after all, the research and development is paid for. The companies were de-risked. The situation we're in today is very different. High-income countries have access to vaccines. We've heard Professor Somoas speak about the situation in Africa, which is really spinning out of control. It is something that more than a year was already recognized. And some of us have been advocating with the World Health Organization to sort of get ahead of the game and establish a pool to bring that intellectual property together. And the WHO did. They moved in May of last year. They established the COVID-19 technology access pool, end of May 2020. And the purpose of that pool was to share the intellectual property, the technology, the know-how, materials that could include cell lines, for example, to enable the scale up and the development, the production of COVID-19 health products, not only vaccines, also other products. Now, the expectation was that since so much government funding was going into the development of these innovations, that aspect would make the sharing of that knowledge and of that intellectual property easier. In reality, I'm sad to say that nothing has happened. This COVID technology access pool is still empty. Now, developing countries witnessing this, because this was also very much a demand from developing countries, proposed, as I think you all know by now, on the 2nd of October 2020, proposed the waiver to the WTO TRIPS agreement. So we saw the discussion move from the WHO to the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and this waiver would allow countries to suspend the protection of certain kinds of intellectual property related to the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19 for the duration of the pandemic. It's actually a rather modest proposal, which is limited to one disease, limited in time, and limited to certain forms of intellectual property. You sometimes hear people talk about as if this is the abolishment of intellectual property. It is no such thing. It's a rather modest, still high-income countries were very rapid in condemning it as too broad in scope. And they said they preferred voluntary mechanisms such as the CTAP. But those same countries, and the European Union is one of those, the European Union is all of a sudden celebrating voluntary mechanisms such as CTAP and the existing TRIPS flexibilities, a set of measures that they have opposed for the last 20 years, but without doing anything to make CTAP happen, to make it a success. The European Union has not made demands on the companies to collaborate with these mechanisms to help accelerate the production of COVID-19 vaccines, for example. Now, the US has changed tack. The US supports the TRIPS waiver, but only for vaccines. And there's, of course, an element of self-interest in there, because as Joe Stiglitz also explained, we're as safe as our neighbor is. And if those vaccines are not available everywhere, no one is safe, including in the countries where vaccines are now being rolled out. Now, the European Union does not support the waiver, not even the limited United States proposed waiver for vaccines only. I just got news from Geneva where informal discussions have ended and there's been no movement at all. The European Union, together with the UK and Switzerland, oppose any progress in the negotiations. So we still don't know where this will be going. The situation is such that the world has capacity for vaccine production of 3.5 billion doses. 11 billion doses are needed now to reach herd immunity. The scale up of vaccine production in various regions of the world is required, and that requires the transfer of IP, which is, as I said, broader than patents. And that's a bit where the challenge is with both the EU proposal to use compulsory licensing, but also to a certain extent the challenge of the TRIPS waiver, because the making sure that companies have all of the elements to be able to scale up production and to be able to produce, they need more than just the intellectual property that you transfer via the patents. So it needs a level of collaboration by those who hold that knowledge. So that is That will remain a challenge, even if the waiver is accepted. Of course, the politics of this is such that when the waiver moves forward, I expect we will start to see much more activity in the field of technology transfer. And that is what we really need. Now, I know we're not done with the current pandemic, but let's look at the future, because one thing has become crystal clear during this crisis, and that is that the world is not prepared. We need better preparedness, but we also need a different legal framework. There are proposals for a pandemic treaty. The discussions about that will start later in this year at the World Health Assembly. And I firmly believe that the pandemic treaty should regulate access to intellectual property and contain technology transfer obligations upfront, so that public financing, and that should include commitments to public financing of needed innovations and mechanisms to make sure that those innovations become global public goods. And that trigger should be automatic. You should not have to sort these things out in the middle of a global pandemic, which is what is happening today, and we see what the results of that is. So with that, I thank you for your attention. We have quite a bit of writing and research. It is all available under open licenses on our website, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Over to you.
Thank you, Hélène. Very interesting and very clear. For one question I would have, you are how to move, and I would speak from a public health professional perspective. What would you suggest for the public health community for the next treaties on pandemic preparedness, for example, etc., to be more active? And how can we be more active in making sure that we discuss those issues of availability of all the products and services that we need for health much more than we do at the moment in the public health community? And I don't speak of those very specialized people that you are, in a way.
Well, first of all, before, because it is in a way a bit odd to talk about the next pandemic when we're not taking action that needs to be taken today. So the public health community today should really join the call, and some of you are leading that vaccines that we have today, and a lot of countries have access vaccines, that those are shipped to countries in need. Those need to be shipped to India, those need to be shipped to Africa, where the pandemic is far from being under control. I saw an article the other day that there's an experiment with vaccinating animals in the zoo. And I think, my goodness, we're going to vaccinate animals while we're not vaccinating people. This is absolutely absurd. So that is sort of an immediate action. That is not a sustainable approach. These donations are not a sustainable approach. That is something that really requires a new framework. And I would suggest to the public health community to link up even more than some of you are already doing, with people who are working on the intellectual property questions. When you look at the successes of the HIV campaigns almost 20 years ago, it was really because it was multidisciplinary, it was global, but there were people from all kinds of backgrounds that came together, and that made a very strong voice. And further, we really need to hammer at the European Union, because you see individual European Union member states take sometimes very good positions, but by the time these positions have gone through the mill in Brussels, DG Trade is in charge again, and we get Dr. No at the World Trade Organization, and there is zero flexibility, while we know that at national level that is often quite different. So we really need to step up, I think, our advocacy work in Brussels as well as at the national level.
Thank you, Hélène. I think I will pass the floor to Elena again, because we are
Yes, we are
Short.
over time, but we're doing our best. And as I wrote in the chat, we have kept all the questions. We'll circle back to the speakers. We thank Professor Stiglitz, who probably has to go, or anybody else staying online. And I pass to the last, but certainly not least of our speakers, Soels Makkelberger, who's associate professor in bioethics and research ethics and news promoventi at the University Medical Center in Groningen, here in the University of Groningen. And she's also an advisor for scientific integrity. And certainly last but not least, we're very happy to have her in the section for public health ethics as president of the European Public Health Association. So Els.
Yes, thank you very much for these kind words, Elena. And I guess that everybody who's still present here somehow has that same brain going on like I have. My brain is buzzing with ideas, and I didn't have my camera on, luckily, because you could have seen me nodding and wanting to respond. And now I can take the floor. And I'm first going to try to share my screen. I hope it works. Can you see my screen now?
Yes. We can. You may want to. Yes, it's perfect.
Yes, that's what I want. Okay. I've actually been asked particularly to talk, amongst other things, about the European philosophical tradition we are in and what kind of European values we would have to cherish when we're talking about the questions that we are tackling today. First of all, I had in my mind a very complicated and complex way of organizing all the arguments, very sophisticated, like ethicists are supposed to do. And then I thought, let's stop that. Let's go back. And really, well, I first of all have to give you my spoiler alert. My main message is we need to start living up to our own European philosophical tradition. And I will try to give some pointers about what it is. So I'm kind of doing that Ethics 101 class that probably many of you will remember. And I think that the key question we are actually dealing with is how do we get to that fair distribution of vaccines? And I must say that I'm in full agreement with Ellen that we shouldn't only think about the COVID-19 situation, but we should also start to think about the future. I fully agree with that point. When we talk about fair distribution of vaccines, we talk about fair distribution, and then the first thing that comes into mind is that we have to think about justice. And now when we go into our European tradition, then we have to thank the Greeks. That's not only because Elena is chairing this, but I think this is a tradition that we should think about, well, time and again. And I think that this is the moment to do that. And I'm going to go very briefly through it. When we look at Aristotle has said tremendous things about justice. And I think what is an important thing also in line with the questions that we have had, it's about people and it's about constitutions and political arrangements. Justice is a virtue of character, which means that we talk about people with just characters. We all know, well, during all these talks, we have heard names of people who have taken the lead or communities who have taken the lead. So that is about people who want to do justice to others. But the other part, and we cannot separate them, is that justice is also a virtue of constitutions and political arrangements. So we need to look at whether these constitutions and political arrangements that we have, are they just? So to me, one of the key questions, of course, is, are the arrangements of the TRIPS agreement just and fair? And luckily, Ellen has already explained to us how, in essence, the patent regulations are about making sure that it is to benefit of society as a whole. Now, it seems that we have forgotten that along the way, and definitely in the discussions that has, well, somehow disappeared in a very gray cloud. So what we need to ask is, do these arrangements contribute to a just and fair distribution of vaccines if we apply them to the situation we are in right now? And what we talk about then is distributive justice. And this is about ensuring that benefits and burdens are distributed among members of society in such a way that is fair and just. Now, I also have to tell you that I'm talking about this in the global context. We've heard this afternoon that we cannot talk about COVID-19 if we do not talk about it in that global context. I will talk about the reflex of my country first later on, but my position is that we have to talk about this in this global context. Now, when we talk about what is fair and just, what are the basic understandings of that? Well, the basis is that we have to give each person what they deserve. So Aristotle said equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally. In this global pandemic, it seems that quite often the first part of this sentence has been used. All humans should have access, but then we forgot that the way that you get access to those vaccines is barred by a variety of thresholds that are not equal to each and everyone. So that means what Aristotle says is that we will have to up our game to ensure that those who are not on that level of equality will get to that level. So we'll need to have to put some extra effort into getting to treat those unequals towards that equal level. Nowadays, we usually say that's a translation of Aristotle's part, that individuals should be treated the same unless they differ in ways that are relevant to the situation in which they are involved. So this general rule is a rule that we should apply to the situation we are in right now. And throughout the talks, this is what I've heard being done by some of you, but without mentioning it. Now, if we look at what would be a fair distribution in a pandemic, what are the crucial values? Ezekiel Emanuel and, well, as you can see, a multitude of colleagues from all over the world have tried to set out some of those crucial values, and they have tried to make it not too complicated. So they limited it to 3 crucial values. They said, if we want to get to a fair distribution, then we should really aim at benefiting people and limiting harm. This might sound very intuitive, and I hope it is, because this should be a given. That's the way that we want to get to a distribution of the vaccines. Again, Ellen, you gave that wonderful example of vaccinating animals in a zoo. This was not one of the values that they have included, because they think that first we need to benefit people. Yes, we can have discussions about that, but in this global pandemic, I think this is one of the crucial elements that we first should have to address. And it shows that example of the vaccination of the animals, that it needs to be mentioned. The second one is that we should prioritize the disadvantaged. Again, intuitively, many people will agree with that, but when you look at actual circumstances, well, I can tell you, I got my 2 vaccinations. I live in a very well-off country, the Netherlands. Actually, there are people who are in much more need of the vaccination than I am. Am I a disadvantaged person? Well, I can tell you, no, I'm not. In many levels, I'm not disadvantaged. The third crucial value that they have offered is that we should have equal moral concern. So in short, it's about non-discrimination. Again, when we see how it works in the global context, then we are discriminating a lot. These authors also said, and I second that, is that limited national partiality is acceptable. Yes, countries will take care of their own community. However, it must be a limited partiality. Again, the arguments have been put forward by many speakers today why it should be limited. It's because it is a global pandemic, and if you only look at yourself and don't look at your neighbor or countries that are farther away from your own country, then you will import the next variant of COVID-19 within seconds. What proposal did they make? They said that there are actually 3 phases for the fair vaccine distribution, and I will not go into all of it. But as you can see in the column of prioritization, what they say is that actually in the first phase, when it is about reducing premature deaths, then you should prioritize those countries that would reduce more standard expected years of life lost per dose of vaccine. Okay, think about that. The second phase, when it's about reducing serious economic and social deprivations, and here you see that they do not only have a pandemic, but also a syndemic in their mind, where it's not only about COVID-19, but also about economic consequences, social consequences. That's when they say that priority should be given to countries that would reduce more poverty, avert more loss of gross national income, and avert more CEYLL per dose of vaccine. The third phase is when we are returning to full functioning, and that's when they say then priority should be given to countries with higher transmission rates. Have we used that? It was published in Science in 2020, in September. People have talked about it. Discussions have been held, and yes, of course, there will be discussions. But as far as I can see, and I come back to Aristotle now, have our governments, constitutions, and so on, organizations, taken up the challenge of this proposal for a fair vaccine distribution? No comment here. This is more of a rhetorical question. And finally, time-wise, I want to stop here because there's a lot more to say. I really think that one of the challenges ahead of us is step up to that philosophical tradition that we have in Europe, that Aristotelian tradition that you can see has influenced the proposal that Emmanuel and colleagues have given us. And we should aim at constitutions and political arrangements that are just. If they are already just, like Ellen, for instance, said about some of the patenting arrangements, then we should emphasize them again and explain them so that people cannot take any disadvantage of that. And I myself thought, shouldn't we have to hold people who want to have a patent, companies who want to hold a patent, up to an ethical commitment document? An ethical commitment document that relates to that fair distribution proposal. It seems that there are too many loopholes right now. And of course, when I say an ethical commitment document, a commitment also implies that you take responsibility. It's not only about saying, yes, I tick the box, but it's also, I will act upon that. This is a very short and quick proposal based on that European philosophical tradition that I cherish and that I hope we will put forward a lot more. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Els, for raising very critical questions and for bringing on board ethical dilemmas from daily life, but also from science and intersecting disciplines. I know we're running 10 minutes late, and Eve will do a roundup for key messages from each and every one of you. But in fairness, only one question for you. We're hearing a lot about corporate social responsibility and relying on ethical initiatives of big pharma or smaller companies to do the right thing and small initiatives. Is it really a realistic expectation to expect this level of activity or problem to be resolved by fragmented initiatives or corporate initiatives, or do we need some other role, some other discussion, if you like, at multi-level, multilateral body? And of course, is there a role for public health professionals in all that? Thanks.
Thank you for that question, because I think it's and. We need people to speak up. And these people can be of influence in those political bodies and so on that we have. And definitely we shouldn't think about separate initiatives and silos. It's of the utmost importance that we speak up together. I know that we can discuss a lot of the details, but I guess that when we look at the crucial values, that we can find agreement on that. If we do not start it, it will never happen. And I must admit that I'm actually very sad about the situation we are in. It's incredible that now we have to talk about this topic. It should be a given in this global world. People have been talking about the global world for decades now. Since the World Wide Web opened, we said, well, we live in a global community. It's only now that we start to realize what the consequences are of living in a global community. That's too late. So we should be prepared for the next whatever pandemic, but not only pandemic. So let's do that. EUPHA has, of course, an influence in there, but there are so many other bodies, so many other people, individuals and associations. And another thing I'm very sad about is that less affluent countries are reliant on the affluent countries, whether they want to give away some of the vaccines they have as leftovers. Actually, it's shameful. So I'm now stepping out of my role of the ethicist who tries to reflect on things. Now I'm the advocate, the people's advocate, I hope. And I really want to call upon Europe, be ashamed of yourself. I'm ashamed to be a European who's part of that system. And I'll stop with that answer.
Thank you very, very much for the passion too. And I pass on to Eve for a roundup. And I think, yeah, thanks, Eve.
Thank you. We are late, but thank you for being with us for those last minutes. And I would like to pass the floor to each of the speakers for your last word after this webinar to tell us what you keep as a key message from what we just heard and discussed in this webinar. So I will start in the same order as the speakers. And Dia Samoa, if you are still with us. Andy?
I think he is, because I can see him in the participants.
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I have found this very, very interesting, and that most of the sentiments expressed reinforces my concern about how the vaccine is being distributed worldwide. And I think we have to push for the vaccine waiver so that all countries in the world should be able to produce the vaccines, because it's a global village. If one part of the world is fully vaccinated and the other part is not vaccinated, we all suffer for it. I have found this very, very interesting discussion, and I've learned so much from the contributions from the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. I pass the floor to George Pavlakis.
Yeah, having a perspective of around 40 years of epidemics, I want to acknowledge the progress that we've made in addressing epidemics. This is unprecedented in AIDS was a little different. This one being an airborne virus, the speed and the destruction all over the world is a little different than AIDS. But you know, acknowledging the improvements, on the other hand, I want to tell you how disappointed I am that we were not more ready, because we can and we should, and we have a long way to go. I hope that the steps will be faster because of all the prior experiences, but the point is that we have a long way to go. We're still in the middle of it, and we have to brace for the long run. And my major concern is that the public is getting very tired and not really cooperative. I don't think that they understand the real threat to our global village if we let this thing keep going.
Thank you, George. Then Hélène Teun.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I think it's important to also celebrate the fact that we've, you know, a bit more than a year into a pandemic, we have a number of effective vaccines. I think that is something as humanity, so to speak, something to be proud of. We need to acknowledge that this was a direct result of the very direct and massive financing by the public sector. And we now need to make sure that these vaccines become people's vaccines. Now, there is an international movement, an international People's Vaccine Alliance, and I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved as an advocate to hook up with that alliance, because that is an enormously large network, spans all countries of the globe with a large variety of people and some wonderful experts in all fields. So that is a very good place to start if you want to get involved. Over.
Thank you, Hélène. And then Els Meckeberger. Do I pronounce well? Sorry.
You pronounce it a lot better than most people do. So thank you. I second everything that everybody else has said. And I, to indeed end on a positive note, this pandemic also has been an accelerator for collaboration, for in science, open science, sharing things. And I hope that we can bring that to the next level. So I hope that it will remain an accelerator in what we are doing. And one of the other things that has been great during this time is that we meet so much more easily via these screens. I would love to see all of you in person, but it's one of the things that has happened. And that's why we definitely share our thoughts way more easily and quickly. And I want to thank once again the organizers of this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I will just say a word that clearly we are, so the waiver for intellectual property is something and it should be done. There is no way we should not do it. It will not be enough. We understand that there are a lot more things to be done. At the same time, it's technical, but also explaining to the citizens all over the world that we are in a situation where everybody has to be involved. And that was said. We cannot think that it will be solved just by pushing and expecting that people understand. So I know there are many people who are now tired of everything and who say, okay, let's do as if nothing is there, because we cannot bear anymore the situation, etc. So we need to be there to push in many directions and to act in many directions. So I hope we can exchange, and those exchanges are very rich. Whatever we think of it, it's not easy to exchange and communicate in those situations where we just have small pictures of each other and very short timing, and but it's very useful for understanding where we have to go all together. So I stop here. Thank you for your presence, for explaining all this to us. And let's do it again with more elaborate questions for the future. Elena?
So thanks very much for the summary. So many issues that were raised, things about the AMR, things about regional production versus local or national networks that Ellen and Professor Stiglitz touched upon, things about lessons from previous, I mean, these require a lot of interdisciplinary discussions. So we hope that this is the first of the series of things we will do in the context of building up to the pandemic treaty, but not only. And I will momentarily share my screen. I don't know whether you can see my PowerPoint. So thanks for today to all the speakers. The next thing that we, in the process of planning, we hope that it will be possible to have a second session on July 19th at 4 p.m. CEST in the context of the Festival of Public Health. And I'm copy pasting the link. It's free for everyone and it's hosted by the University of Manchester. We are also mindful of other issues important for public health. Some have to do with regulatory authorities, vaccine hesitancy, and so on. So we hope we've collected all your questions. We hope that we will start developing working papers and updating all EUPHA members and also everybody else that is interested in public health and global public health issues in relation to the pandemic treaty and of course to COVID-19, but not only. Thank you. Thanks also very much to Iveta Nagyova, which is the president of EUPHA, for supporting this in many ways. To Dineke Ziegers, I hope she's still with us. Of course, to George and to Els and to Andy and to Professor Stiglitz or Joe, who's no longer here with us. And to all of you that managed to stay until the end of the session, although we are 23 minutes over time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Copy pasting all the comments. So I'm also adding, if somebody has not managed to send their questions, they can email us. My email. So if you, yep. Okay. Thank you. I will terminate the meeting now, but feel free to drop us any questions that you didn't manage to during the meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Have a good evening.